Hello, I'm Matteo, and today I'm very excited to get to show some of the work that I've been doing recently. And if you know me, you may know that I worked on the decoupled architecture for Drupal, and early on I realized that there was a different way to build websites. And what if Drupal allow you to do that? So I worked on that quite a lot. I also wanted to bring in some of the best practice in building object-oriented code for Drupal, because Drupal 8 wants you to build object-oriented code, but it doesn't have guidelines or guardrails on how to do it, and it can become very messy soon. So I built the typed entity module for that, and today I want to take a look on how we build UI components. And for that, I think that the JavaScript community has it right. They have developed quite a few tools that make them very productive, especially when they deal with design systems or pattern libraries. And they have adopted a myriad of build tools, and also hot reloading, and all those features are not available for Drupal, or they haven't been traditionally. So one of the solutions that we have adopted has been to use the components module, which I'm pulling up right now, and this allows us to build pattern libraries, extract our components into somewhere else, and we can share that somewhere else with, let's say, Storybook, or we can share it with Drupal. So both of them are able to render our tweak components. But there are two fundamental problems with this approach, and one is that the pattern library that you are rendering, let's say Storybook, uses Twig.js, and Twig.js is not the same as the Drupal render pipeline. And therefore, you will ultimately have differences in the way that it renders from Twig.js in your Storybook, let's say, and in your Drupal, because they have different rendering pipelines, and they compile the page differently. That's the first main limitation. The second main limitation is that components are not templates, and the components module lets you have a handy way to locate templates, but components are a bit more than that. Components should be auto-contained, encapsulated, and they should carry the information of their styles, their behaviors, etc. So when you're composing different components, then you are aggregating all those styles, assets, JavaScript, HTML, the template, which is a fundamental part of it, but it's not enough for a component. So I have worked on these different modules and JavaScript tools that work together to give us a seamless experience when working with components. And today I'm going to take a very brief look at what is possible and what the end goal is, and then I'm gonna go back in subsequent videos and explain how I got there. And it's actually quite simple, but if you're curious, I would tell you that start reading the component libraries components, or CL components module. The documentation page is quite elaborated, and it has other links to more documentation on how you can first create your components, and second, you can embed them in the traditional Drupal template. And we'll see some of that in a bit, but that may make no sense, and you may want to look more into what's happening. So one of the things that is worth noting is that you can include the components using either the traditional Twig syntax with include and embed by passing the component ID and maybe a variant of the component. That's optional. But just with the component ID, you can load the whole component. And here you're not including just a template, you're including a template with all of its styles, and JavaScript. And this is the new syntax. It uses a new keyword called inject, and you inject a component ID with some data, and then call and inject, and everything that is in between the inject and inject is captured. Like for instance, in this example, I'm injecting the card, and here I inject the card. So everything in between here is going to be captured and stored in a variable that's called children. So when I'm declaring my card component, I can render the children component wherever I want. And what that will get is whatever the user has in between inject and inject. This is more similar to how React works, and I find to be very intuitive. If you start at a content type and you inject your component for that content type, and then inside of it start injecting your components for your fields. But we'll see some of that in a bit, because ideally you will no longer start developing your components by refreshing Drupal, because that's very frustrating, because you need to go and refresh your browser, clear caches many times, and that's kind of it's a tough way of doing it, because you need to go and put it in some page, and then with that start seeing if it works in your theme, right? What I'm proposing is that you just work on your components. So here I'm pulling up the primary variant of my component called my button, and I'm gonna say, all right, no, I don't think that blue works here. I'm gonna do it green, and when I save the file, hold on. All right, do I have caching in the browser? I want to disable the caching. All right, let's see. See that I want this green. I save and I have it there. Remember to disable the browser cache, of course. So that's kind of a big deal, because you can have your component fully working, see how my JavaScript interactions are working. And by the way, this is also a limitation of using Twig.js. In Twig.js, you have to do some weird stuff to bind JavaScript to your components, because Drupal expects your JavaScript to look like this. But Storybook doesn't know anything about these Drupal behaviors thingy, right? So that's kind of a big thing as well. So let's change, and let's start the counter at 21 and save here, and hot reloads when I click, then it increments to 22. So hot reloading of JavaScript and CSS works out of the box, and that's pretty. That improves the developer experience and the productivity. Another cool thing is that when you're here in Storybook, you can start to do things like, all right, does my button work with, oops, maybe not that. With long names, right? And you see that, all right, I don't like how this looks, so I will need to take this and work maybe on some wrapping. But what I want to do is I want to write a story to make sure that I bookmark these settings that I have here. So I work on the settings, and then when I'm happy that I reached an edge case that I want to cover, copy it to your stories. Like this, all right? A long text. And then say that oops, something like that. All right, so then I have this long text story, and this this is still getting the old configuration, right? This long text, and now I can work on the CSS to maybe wrap the button, so there is only to not wrap the text in the button, and to work on the overflow, so there is only one line. So that's kind of the productivity booster that you get. But also when you're working with composing components, you can just add inside of Storybook the components as you would do inside of your Drupal templates. Like here, if I wanted to have, let's say, another button, you just copy it in here, and you see how this way you can start building quickly complex interfaces that you can then style. Let's say that I want this button to be a primary button. All right, so what I added was this variant primary, and it becomes a primary button. And now if I, let's say, save this, you can see that even when you're working with a composed component, library loading still works, and you still get the benefits of that. Another great thing about doing this in this way is that with Twig.js working in Storybook, you're getting some rendering of your component. But how does Twig.js know what Drupal theme is rendering it? Because the same component will most certainly look different if you render it with Claro or Umami or 7 or your custom theme, right? So it's very important that we work in a way that there is a single render pipeline for Storybook and for Drupal alike. So take this into consideration when you're using projects using Twig.js, because you will always have to use your component library, but then double QA it that it works in Drupal, which is kind of defeating this productivity boost that you're looking when you're using these component libraries. And let's see what localcontrib.com, what this looks like when you're doing in Drupal. So let's say that we're tired of this big banner, and instead we want to use our card, right? And for that, we've worked on a combination of the card, that would be for Umami, and a combination of the card with some buttons, maybe some accordions that we downloaded from a contributed project called Carbon Components. And here, let me interject that with all this architecture, one of the main goals is to be able to work like the JavaScript world does. There is an NPM package that is called Carbon Components, which is the IBM's design system that you import, and then you just fill in the data. You get the components from somewhere else, and then you just map the components. And the idea is that we should be able to do the same with Composer. And I have gone ahead and created a small Composer package that uses TypeScript, SCSS, and then compiles everything in a way that Drupal can understand it, and maps these Carbon components by doing so. I installed the Node.js package, and there you go. I applied all the styles that it needs, and then I initialized the accordion. There you go. It initializes all that it needs. But that's the component library author. As a user, I can just use this, and as proof, you can see that it works inside of Drupal perfectly as one would expect, right? All right, so let's take a look at Drupal. We're looking to replace this that blocks banner promo block. All right, so I have some commented out code in here, but what we want to do is we want to take this out, and you can see here that if I refresh, the block goes out, and I want to inject my components. So let me refresh and see, it's a card. Let's take a look how it looks like. So I started by injecting a card and inject my card. You need to pass the same ID at the end so you know what you're closing when you're reading the code. So the card will have the image of the block, which we're taking from the field media image, and then we put the same text that it was showing, which is everything that it has in the content variable without the image and the link, because the link we're gonna render inside of a carbon accordion. In the accordion item, the first one will have the link of it, and the second one will have whatever, some random text and a button. And in this case, I'm choosing to inject to include the button with the traditional syntax, so you can see that it works as well. When you don't have any captured children and you don't have anything in between inject and inject, you can pretty much use the old include syntax. Or if you prefer to work with blocks and embeds, you can do that as well. You could do embed. And then down here, you need to do, for this syntax, and embed. So this is something that's built into Twig, right? If I refresh, you'll see that the button is still rendering. So that's how easy it is to start building UI elements, and you'll see that there is no UI difference whatsoever in between what you see here and what you see in here. That's kind of the goal. And to recap, we want to work with components, and there is a special way that you need to work the components, but you'll see that the CL components comes with two examples, the my button and my card, and then there is a separate composer package that has the accordion, and you can take a look, or you can look at the documentation in the project page. So we use components because templates are by themselves are not enough. But then we also realize that using Twig.js to render what's inside of Storybook, that's not reliable. We cannot work like that. If we had Drupal render everything, we could rely what we're seeing in Storybook, and we wouldn't need to wonder what will it look like when I add all my CSS and JavaScript from the theme atop with what I'm seeing in Storybook, right? You'll see everything, and the proof is that you can with the Storybook integration, with the Storybook Drupal add-on, that is also linked in the documentation, you'll get this drop down for selecting the theme that you want. And finally, the way that we start authoring UIs using components and the top down instead of the bottom up approach to build components, meaning that you use the components and then, all right, have a card, and inside of a card, I'll have all this, have an accordion, and inside of the first item of the accordion, I'll have the content. So this is more intuitive or more relatable to how projects like React are doing things. Then I'm gonna render a variable, and then I'm gonna have to put a file and magically name it in a place that is gonna be picked up, and then it's gonna render what the next part of the pipeline, and then it's gonna disappear again, and I'm gonna find again using code comments in the DOM, and I find it powerful and useful, but sometimes not as intuitive and productive as I would like it to be. And with this approach, you can have both. You can have the both approaches and mix them, because you will have to mix them together, and that's how you will get the best results. And that's it. Hopefully you like this and you start giving it a try and provide feedback. Ta-da!